Hey guys, tonight we begin with the final days of Queen Elizabeth I, the last Tudor monarch and one of England's most iconic rulers. She led her country through an age of flourishing art, decisive victories, and the forging of empire. But behind the crown and power was a woman whose death remains one of history's most enigmatic royal endings. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. By the winter of 1602, Elizabeth I was approaching her 70th year, an age few reached in Tudor England. Her skin, once powdered into porcelain perfection, had begun to betray the fragility beneath. Her brilliant auburn wigs, once symbols of youthful power, now sat atop a body weathered by nearly half a century of rule. For 44 years, she had reigned alone. She had outlived rivals, buried suitors, and silenced every threat that rose against her. But now, the iron will that had defined the Queen was beginning to crack. Though her mind was still sharp, those around her noticed something was shifting. Her appetite had waned. Her presence at court had grown sporadic. The fire that once radiated from her throne at Whitehall seemed dimmed, and with the turning of the year, rumours began to whisper through the tapestried halls of Richmond Palace. Rumours that their sovereign was fading. There had been loss. Painful, personal loss. The execution of Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, in 1601, had struck a deep blow. Though he had betrayed her, leading a failed rebellion and attempting to seize power, Elizabeth I had loved him in her own way. Some said it was motherly affection. Others whispered of something deeper. Regardless, watching him walk to the scaffold tore at her. She never truly recovered from that grief. In her final winter, she would spend long hours standing, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat. Servants noted that she rarely sat, and even less did she speak. When she did, her voice was thin, trailing like smoke. Sometimes, she would gaze into the empty fireplace for hours, unmoving, as if staring into something far beyond it, something only she could see. The court began to prepare. Physicians offered tinctures, tonics, and prayers, but the Queen dismissed them all. Ministers gently urged her to rest, to speak, to name a successor. But the once commanding monarch only shook her head. Something weighed on her heart, heavier than politics. Heavier, perhaps, than the crown itself. As March approached, one truth began to settle among those closest to her. The reign of Elizabeth I was quietly, painfully, coming to an end. As the days passed, the gloom that filled Elizabeth I's private chamber at Richmond Palace deepened. The once vibrant court, famous for its music, pageantry, and lively discourse, had grown hushed. The Queen, who had dazzled Europe with her wit and resolve, was now wrapped in heavy silks, surrounded by shadows and silence. She no longer held council meetings, nor did she take her usual rides or walks in the gardens. Her ladies-in-waiting, the closest and most trusted women in her life, were dismissed one by one from her room until she remained mostly alone. Even the few she allowed to stay, such as Lady Scrope, spoke only in soft, uncertain tones, unsure if their presence comforted or agitated her. Her mind, they whispered, was slipping. It was during this time that her physicians began to observe something troubling. Not only was the Queen refusing food, she had also started to resist sleep altogether. She would stand for hours on end, rooted to the same spot by her bed or by the window, as if the very act of lying down might bring death closer. When her legs could no longer support her, she would sit stiffly on cushions, eyes fixed on some invisible point, lips moving silently in prayer or thought. Some speculated that she feared death not as a woman, but as a ruler. For decades, Elizabeth I had been the embodiment of England itself. To die meant to relinquish control. of her people, her image, and her power. Perhaps that was what she truly feared, the end of control. Physically, her health began to decline in ways subtle but certain. She developed a persistent cough. Her skin turned increasingly pale, and her frame seemed to shrink beneath her ornate gowns. The weight loss was alarming. Yet she forbade any attempt to examine her too closely. Her vanity, even in sickness, remained intact. And through it all, one question loomed in every courtier's mind but was rarely voiced aloud. Was this simply old age catching up to the Queen? Or was something hidden festering beneath the surface? The answer, for now, remained locked behind her lips. Lips that once commanded empires, now barely moved at all. To understand the weight pressing down on Elizabeth I in her final weeks, one must look not only at her body, but at her heart. And more precisely, at the ghost that haunted it, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex. Their relationship had been volatile. Essex was dashing, ambitious, and impulsive. He flattered her, defied her, then begged for forgiveness, only to betray her again. In him, Elizabeth I saw both potential and peril. Despite his arrogance, she had favoured him, elevating him to great influence within her court. But in time, his ambition turned dangerous. In 1601, he launched a coup, a desperate, ill-conceived rebellion to seize power. She had no choice. The crown could not tolerate treason, no matter how charming the traitor. Elizabeth signed the death warrant herself. And when he was beheaded in the Tower of London, something inside her unravelled. From that moment forward, witnesses say the Queen began to change. It wasn't just sadness. It was as if a deep, corrosive guilt had lodged itself in her soul. Some claimed she carried a locket containing his portrait. Others swore she muttered his name in the dead of night. Whether these tales were true or the invention of romantic courtiers, the effect was undeniable. The Queen who had once seemed untouchable now appeared human and deeply wounded. Grief in that age was poorly understood. What we now recognise as depression might have been seen as melancholia, a spiritual imbalance rather than an emotional one. But those around her saw it clearly. Her eyes had dulled. Her laughter ceased. Her energy faded. The courtiers who had once competed for her affection now stepped more cautiously. They feared her moods, unsure how far her sorrow might drag her down. She stopped composing letters. She stopped approving documents. She even stopped attending chapel, a sign more shocking than any, given her deeply Protestant faith. And perhaps most telling of all, she refused music. Elizabeth I had adored music all her life. She had sung, played instruments, and surrounded herself with composers and poets. Now she asked for silence. The Queen's heart, it seemed, had broken long before her body followed. As March of 1603 drew near, the decline of Elizabeth I was no longer hidden. What began as grief and withdrawal was now a public spectacle. Her slow, tragic unravelling witnessed by nobles, courtiers, and servants alike. The once commanding sovereign, who had outwitted kings and silenced dissenters, now seemed adrift within her own palace. She would not speak of her condition. In fact, she barely spoke at all. She answered questions with gestures or simple nods. Days passed without a full sentence leaving her lips. When her advisers pressed her for guidance, on affairs of state, on the matter of succession, or on her own health, she turned away, retreating into herself as if words had become too heavy to lift. Physicians, summoned in increasing urgency, debated her symptoms. Some believed she suffered from a settling of humours, the vague Tudor diagnosis for mental or physical imbalance. Others suggested a cold distemper of the brain. But no one could agree on a cure, because no one could truly understand the cause. At this time, her physical posture became symbolic of her mental state. She refused to lie down. For hours, even days, she remained upright, sometimes leaning against cushions, sometimes gripping the arms of her chair, but never fully reclining. It was as though she believed that surrendering to sleep would mean surrendering to death. Servants would later report how the Queen stood silently in the corner of her room, cloaked in heavy black, unmoving for hours at a time. At night, they took turns watching her, unsure whether she was praying, mourning, or simply lost. The palace around her seemed to fall into a hush. Courtiers spoke in whispers. Nobles paced outside her door, anxious for news. And all the while, the air grew thick with unspoken fear, not just of losing their queen, but of what might come after. The realm had no clear heir. And though Elizabeth had long refused to name one, everyone suspected that James VI of Scotland would be chosen. But without her voice, without her seal, would her will be honoured? England was no stranger to power struggles, and a queen's silence could turn into a nation's chaos. The silence was no longer just hers, it was England's, holding its breath. Among the many whispered theories about Elizabeth I's death, one stands out, not because of its drama, but because of its slow, invisible nature. It wasn't a sword or poison goblet that may have killed her, but rather something far more insidious, her makeup. For decades, the Queen had adorned her face with a signature white mask of beauty, a thick layer of cosmetic powder known as Venetian ceruse. It was a fashion born from the aristocracy, designed to signal nobility, purity, and wealth. The mixture, however, contained two key ingredients: vinegar and white lead. Yes, lead. A metal we now know to be toxic, even in small quantities. Applied daily, layer upon layer, this lead-based makeup was absorbed through the skin. Over time, it could damage the nervous system, weaken the muscles, cloud the mind, and ultimately shorten the lifespan. The symptoms of lead poisoning read like a shadowed list of Elizabeth's final months: fatigue, depression, tremors, loss of appetite, cognitive decline, and skin deterioration. Her contemporaries noted that her teeth had blackened and fallen out. Her hair, once bright and flame red, had thinned and disappeared. Her skin, beneath the paint, was marked by sores and blemishes, signs that were hidden from the public behind pearl-studded wigs and powdered masks. And yet, the Queen remained committed to the illusion. She insisted on presenting the image of eternal youth, even as her body rebelled. That makeup was not just vanity, it was armor. And like any armor, it came with weight. In this case, a poisonous one. Some modern historians believe that long-term lead exposure may have contributed significantly to her physical and mental decline. The irritability, the confusion, the refusal to sleep or eat. Even the depression that followed the death of Robert Devereux might have been magnified by chemical imbalance. But in her day, no one understood these dangers. Venetian ceruse was celebrated. It was even imported and used across Europe. The very thing that made Elizabeth I iconic may have also been one of the slowest, most cruel contributors to her downfall. In the end, the white mask that defined her public image may have also quietly hastened the fading of the woman beneath it. By the second week of March, 1603, the condition of Elizabeth I had become undeniable. Her courtiers now moved with urgency, though careful not to show panic. The Queen had stopped eating entirely. Her body, already thin, seemed to retreat into itself, her bones visible beneath the ornate fabrics that once projected power and grace. She was wasting away, and yet no one could give her illness a name. Tudor medicine had no clear diagnostic tools. There were no thermometers, no microscopes, no concept of infection as we know it. Illness was a matter of humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If those were imbalanced, disease followed. Treatments involved bleeding, herbal poultices, or purging the system. And yet, none of these worked, because no one truly understood what was happening inside the Queen. Modern scholars have suggested that she may have succumbed to pneumonia. The cold air in Richmond Palace, mixed with long hours of standing and fasting, may have led to a lung infection. A persistent cough, chills, and a slow slide into delirium align with such a theory. And without antibiotics, even a mild case of pneumonia was potentially fatal. Others speculate blood poisoning, possibly due to abscessed teeth or infected sores under her cosmetics. Dental hygiene was poor, and Elizabeth had already lost several teeth. Infections in the mouth, if left untreated, could enter the bloodstream, a deadly condition known today as septicemia. But none of these possibilities could be confirmed in her time. And so, her physicians guessed. They used herbal tonics, tried warm compresses, and prayed. But Elizabeth would have none of it. She rejected all medicine. She would not allow incisions, nor bleedings. She even refused to undress completely, guarding her modesty to the very end. And through it all, she said almost nothing. The silence around her became part of the illness. Her servants tiptoed. Her ladies wept in private. Her ministers watched, helpless, as the one figure who had dominated their lives for decades began to vanish, not in a blaze, but like a candle slowly dying in its holder. No one could help her. No one even knew what to call it. And so they simply waited for the end, or a miracle. Though her body was failing, it wasn't illness alone that burdened Elizabeth I. It was the immense, inescapable weight of rule. For over 4 decades, she had stood as the embodiment of England. Her crown was not just a symbol of power, it was a living thing, fed by every decision she made, every speech she delivered, and every threat she outwitted. But now, in the stillness of her chamber, that crown sat heavy and unclaimed. And the question of what came next loomed over the dying queen like a storm. Elizabeth had no children, no direct heir. The Tudor line, so fiercely defended and glorified, was ending with her. And though she had maintained a lifetime of political control, she had long resisted naming a successor. Why? Perhaps because naming one meant acknowledging her own mortality, something she had stubbornly refused to do. The most obvious candidate was James VI of Scotland, son of Mary, Queen of Scots, whom Elizabeth had executed decades prior. He was male, Protestant, and had a legitimate claim through his great-grandmother, Margaret Tudor. But his rise to the English throne would not be simple. Factions existed. Old grudges remained. Catholic claimants still lurked in the shadows. As the Queen's strength faded, pressure mounted on her to make a formal declaration. Ministers, especially Robert Cecil, the Secretary of State, pressed gently, but firmly. England could not be left rudderless. Civil war was not a memory so distant as to be forgotten. And in a world where monarchs ruled by divine right, the death of a queen without clear succession was a recipe for chaos. But Elizabeth remained silent. Some say she gestured when asked if James should be king, perhaps a subtle nod, perhaps nothing at all. Others claim she whispered, "I will have no rascal to succeed me," only to later accept the inevitable. But there is no record, no firm confirmation. The monarch who had delivered some of history's most memorable speeches would not speak her final decision. It is possible that, in her mind, acknowledging a successor was equal to surrendering, to admitting that her story, her dynasty, and her era were truly coming to a close. And perhaps that was more painful than death itself. As March drew on and the hours grew colder, those attending Elizabeth I faced a peculiar and increasingly disturbing reality. The Queen refused to sleep. Not occasionally, but entirely. Days and nights blended into one endless vigil as she remained seated or standing in her chamber, eyes distant, spirit detached. To many, it seemed that the Queen was terrified not of death, but of what lay between her and death: rest. There were moments when her attendants begged her to lie down, but she resisted with such force that they stopped asking. Her refusal wasn't rooted in stubbornness alone. It carried the weight of superstition and sorrow. In Tudor times, sleep was often viewed as a temporary death, a time when the soul drifted dangerously close to the beyond. And Elizabeth I, despite her formidable logic and intellect, may have believed that if she closed her eyes, she would never open them again, and so she sat. Sometimes hunched in her chair, other times leaning against the wall, she defied the limitations of her failing body. The swelling in her legs worsened. Her breathing grew shallow, but still, she would not lie in bed. Her servants tried to coax her with music. She turned it away. They brought warm drinks. She waved them off. She did not wish to be comforted, nor convinced. It was as if she was standing watch over her own death, refusing to give it an invitation. Eventually, her strength began to betray her. She collapsed several times. On one occasion, she was found crumpled beside her chair, unwilling to cry out for help. After that, her ladies-in-waiting took turns staying close, hovering like ghosts of the court she had once commanded. Even they no longer spoke to her unless spoken to first. The atmosphere in the room was one of reverence, sorrow, and dread. When at last she agreed to lie in bed, it was not from peace, but from exhaustion. Her body had given out. She was placed beneath the covers gently, like a fragile relic being lowered into silk. It was the first time she had rested in days, and for many, it felt like the beginning of the end. The moment Elizabeth I allowed herself to be laid in bed, her chamber transformed. The silence grew heavier, more sacred. Those closest to her gathered, advisors, ladies, physicians, each one aware that this was not just the death of a woman, but the closing of an age. The Tudor dynasty, which had ruled England for over a century, was ending with her final breath. The room was dim. Tapestries muffled footsteps. Candles flickered. Outside, the palace held its breath. No proclamations were issued, no bells tolled. Only whispers passed through the corridors of Richmond Palace. Those who had served her for decades now found themselves standing still, waiting for a word, a sign, a farewell that would never come. Despite the gravity of the moment, Elizabeth I said nothing. She had once been a queen of eloquence. Her words could rouse armies, silence parliaments, and charm foreign courts. But now, as she drifted between consciousness and sleep, not a single parting phrase escaped her lips. Not to her ladies, not to her council, not even to the realm she had so long protected. Instead, she communicated through faint movements, slight nods, flickers of the eyes, the barest tremble of her hands. Some thought they saw her reach toward the crown resting nearby. Others claimed she gestured toward a portrait of James VI, the presumed successor. But there were no declarations, no final speech to echo through history. What did she see, lying there in silence? Perhaps visions from her reign, the young girl imprisoned by her sister Mary, the triumphant queen greeting the troops at Tilbury, the glittering court of poets and explorers, the fires of religious wars, the execution of Mary Queen of Scots, the death of the Earl of Essex. A life of power, shadowed by solitude. Outside her chamber, preparations had already begun. Courtiers quietly packed their belongings. Ambassadors wrote coded letters to their kings. Messengers waited with horses ready. They all knew what came next. And yet, until the last moment, England remained a kingdom without a sovereign. For until her last breath, Elizabeth I was still queen. No one could take her place. Not yet. Not until she was gone. As the final hours of Elizabeth I's life unfolded, those who remained in her chamber stood like statues, silent, sorrowful, and uncertain. The queen no longer responded to touch or sound. Her breathing had grown shallow, irregular. Her skin, pale from age and illness, now took on an ashen hue. The fire in her had gone from a steady flame to a flickering ember. Lady Scrope, one of her most faithful attendants, refused to leave her side. She held the queen's hand and dabbed her brow with linen soaked in rosewater. Others stood in the background, whispering prayers, some aloud, others in their hearts. There was no ritual for this. There had never been a monarch like her before. Outside, Richmond Palace was wrapped in a quiet anxiety. No proclamation had yet been made, and still, No one dared call her death until the final breath passed. Messengers stood ready at the gates, prepared to ride to Scotland the moment it was confirmed, to deliver the news to James VI, the man who would be king. Inside, time seemed to warp. The minutes dragged like hours, and no one dared speak of what would come next. Even Robert Cecil, the chief architect of the peaceful transition to the House of Stuart, stood still, his papers folded in his hand. His greatest political manoeuvre, uniting England and Scotland under one crown, was moments away, yet entirely dependent on a woman in her final moments. Then, just before dawn on March the 24th, 1603, it happened. No cry, no gasp, just silence. The room remained motionless for a full minute, as if all feared the breath might return. Then quietly, Lady Scrope covered the Queen's face with a linen cloth. It was over. Elizabeth I was dead. Her passing was not marked with fanfare, nor even with a priest's final rites. She had refused them all. The Virgin Queen, as she was so often called, had died alone, surrounded not by family or heirs, but by the weight of history. A monarch born of scandal, who ruled through storms and fire, now passed into legend with the same dignity she held in life. Quiet, unbending, and ultimately unknowable. The death of Elizabeth I sent a chill across the kingdom, not because it was unexpected, but because of what it left behind. A throne without a voice, a court without direction, and a realm uncertain of its next heartbeat. She had been the only monarch many in England had ever known. Her presence was woven into the fabric of everyday life, her image stamped onto coin and conscience alike. Now that image was still. Immediately after her death, her body was left undisturbed. According to tradition, her ladies kept vigil beside her, whispering psalms through trembling lips. A single candle burned at her bedside. The cloth over her face did not conceal her identity. It preserved it, as though the nation needed one final moment to believe she was truly gone. But while grief settled inside the walls of Richmond, elsewhere, wheels were already turning. Robert Cecil, perhaps the only man who truly understood the scale of this moment, stepped into motion. His secret correspondences with James VI of Scotland had prepared for this day. The couriers were sent, riding with breathless urgency through muddy spring roads, carrying news that would transform two kingdoms. Meanwhile, back in London, the people waited. No bells rang. No mourning was declared. The court kept the death quiet for several hours, fearing unrest or opportunistic power plays. But word eventually seeped out, first through servants, then to merchants and clergy. The Queen was gone, and with her, so too went the Tudors. There was no child, no sibling, no cousin raised at her side to step into her place. Elizabeth had left behind no personal heir, only the political hope that her choice, unspoken but widely assumed, would be honoured. The Privy Council met in hushed tones. The moment was fragile. A kingdom needed direction, and fast. The fear of factionalism, of Catholic uprisings, of foreign meddling, all these haunted their thoughts. The bloodshed of past successions loomed like a shadow. Yet the Queen's long silence had not stopped her government from preparing. Within hours of her death, the Council declared that James VI of Scotland would become James I of England. A new dynasty began. But even as the nation turned toward the future, it did so in mourning. For the woman who had shaped an age and left behind a silence no crown could fill. After the Council announced the succession of James VI, now James I of England, the focus shifted to the care of the Queen's body. Elizabeth I, who had guarded her image with almost obsessive control throughout her reign, could no longer maintain the illusion. The mask she had worn, both literal and symbolic, was beginning to fall away. In life, she had been meticulous about appearances. She rarely allowed herself to be seen without her full regalia, the white lead makeup, the elaborate gowns, the fiery wigs. Even in her final days, She kept her chamber darkened and denied most visitors. Vanity, yes, but also power. To appear weak was to risk everything in a court filled with ambition and knives. Now, in death, her body told a different story. As her ladies gently prepared her for burial, they began to see what had long been hidden beneath layers of silk and powder. Her skin bore the signs of age and illness, bruising, lesions, and the pale, unnatural hue from years of toxic cosmetics. Her hands, once adorned with rings and scepters, were thin and bony. Her hair, what little remained, had turned wispy and white. There was no denying it. Elizabeth I had been dying long before she allowed anyone to see it. And yet, in death, there was something profound about her humanity. She was no longer Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, or the untouchable monarch on coins and canvases. She was a woman who had carried a kingdom on her back for 4 decades and paid the price with her body. No embalming was done immediately. The tradition at the time was to delay the burial to allow time for national mourning and for proper ceremony. Her body lay in state, dressed one final time in royal robes, crown placed above her brow, orb and sceptre at her side. For all the imperfections now visible, her people still came to pay respects, not just to the queen she had been, but to the person she had become. A woman of contradictions, powerful and alone, brilliant and burdened, fierce and fragile. The mask had slipped away, but what remained was not less regal, only more real. On April the 28th, 1603, more than a month after her death, the body of Elizabeth I was finally laid to rest. The delay had not been caused by negligence, but by reverence. England had lost its longest reigning monarch to date, and such a passing demanded a ceremony that would match the magnitude of her legacy. Her funeral procession began at Whitehall and moved slowly toward Westminster Abbey. The streets of London were lined with mourners, nobles, clergy, commoners. Thousands of faces turned toward the carriage that bore their queen one final time. Some wept, others stood in solemn silence. There were no cheers, no songs, only the tolling of bells and the shuffle of boots on stone. The coffin was draped in velvet and borne upon a massive hearse drawn by 4 horses. Above it sat an effigy of Elizabeth I, dressed in state robes with crown, orb and sceptre, eyes open, face serene, as if still watching over her people. The image was so lifelike that many believed it to be her real body, propped upright in death. Behind the hearse marched an honour guard, followed by the nobles of her court, members of parliament, and ambassadors from foreign nations. Each step echoed the weight of transition. A queen was being buried, but an entire era was being mourned. At Westminster Abbey, she was interred in the vault beside her half-sister, Mary I, a symbolic reunion between 2 queens once bitterly divided by religion and rivalry. On the tomb, the inscription reads, "Partners in throne and grave, here rest we 2 sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." The irony was not lost on historians. In life, the sisters had been enemies. In death, they lay side by side. The funeral marked more than the end of a monarch. It marked the end of the Tudor dynasty. With Elizabeth gone, so too ended the lineage that had brought England out of the Wars of the Roses and into an age of exploration, cultural flourishing, and national pride. And as the Abbey's great doors closed behind her, an entire kingdom stood changed. The Elizabethan age was over. What came next would be shaped by a different hand and a different crown. More than 4 centuries have passed since Elizabeth I took her final breath, and yet the mystery surrounding her death remains. Unlike monarchs who died in battle or by clear illness, Elizabeth's decline was veiled in silence, secrecy, and contradictions. As a result, scholars, physicians, and curious minds have continued to speculate. What exactly killed the Virgin Queen? The most common theory is simple: old age. At nearly 70 years old, Elizabeth had far outlived most of her contemporaries. After 4 decades of rule and countless personal losses, her body may have simply succumbed to time. Her refusal to eat, drink, or rest certainly contributed to her decline, and without modern medicine, even a minor ailment could turn fatal. Another compelling theory is pneumonia. The Queen reportedly caught a chill shortly before her final decline. Cold, damp conditions in Richmond Palace, combined with her weakened state, may have allowed an infection to take root. With no antibiotics and only rudimentary treatments, pneumonia would have been devastating. Yet other theories point to lead poisoning. Her famous white makeup, Venetian ceruse, was known to contain white lead, a toxic substance absorbed through the skin. Over decades, it could have damaged her organs, caused psychological changes, and slowly poisoned her from within. Symptoms such as fatigue, irritability, and cognitive decline all match modern understandings of chronic lead exposure. Then there is the possibility of blood poisoning, perhaps from an infected tooth or sore. Dental health was notoriously poor, and Elizabeth had suffered tooth loss and decay. A small infection could easily have entered her bloodstream, resulting in septicemia, a silent killer in an era without understanding of bacteria or sterilization. Finally, some historians explore the emotional and psychological toll, grief and depression. The loss of Robert Devereux and other beloved confidants seemed to break something within her. Her refusal to lie down, her long silences, her deep melancholy, all could be signs of profound psychological suffering, which, untreated, may have hastened her end. In truth, it may have been all of these factors: age, illness, poison, grief, woven together in a tapestry of decline. A queen who carried an empire may have finally been crushed beneath its weight. And yet, in her silence, she left no confession, only a legend. Elizabeth I's death was not merely the close of a life, it was the close of an identity that England had worn for more than 40 years. She had reigned alone, without husband or child, carving her image into the very soul of a nation. Her passing was quiet, private, and full of unanswered questions, but the echo of her reign thundered into the centuries that followed. The country she left behind was vastly different from the one she inherited. When she first ascended the throne in 1558, England was fractured by religious war, threatened by foreign powers, and teetering on the edge of instability. Through sheer will, political genius, and theatrical leadership, Elizabeth I transformed it into a formidable kingdom, confident, culturally vibrant, and respected on the world stage. Her death, however, revealed the fragility beneath that surface. She had held everything together through force of personality and presence. With her gone, a power vacuum threatened to reopen old wounds. The peaceful transition to James I marked a diplomatic victory, but also a seismic shift. The Tudor flame had gone out. The Stuart dawn was uncertain, and yet, what lingered in the minds of her people wasn't just the politics, it was her persona, the speeches at Tilbury, the defiant rejection of marriage, the cultivated image of the Virgin Queen, the jewels, the gowns, the high forehead, the poetic rhetoric. All of it became mythic. Even her final silence served her legacy. She exited the world on her own terms, offering no final word, no dying gasp for legacy or pity. In life, she had been a master of performance. In death, she let the silence speak louder than any closing act. To this day, historians still debate the details of her death, but few debate her impact. The Elizabethan age remains one of the most celebrated periods in English history. Her name became shorthand for a golden era of poetry, exploration, and national pride. And though her body rests quietly beneath the stones of Westminster Abbey, her story continues to live in pages, on stages, and in the very spirit of the monarchy she once ruled. She died alone, but she did not die forgotten. Long before chocolate bars lined grocery store shelves and hot cocoa warmed winter hands, cacao was something entirely different. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't even eaten. It was drunk, bitter, frothy, and sacred. And for the ancient peoples of Mesoamerica, this strange, powerful bean held more than flavor. It held meaning. Our story begins over 3,000 years ago, deep in the tropical rainforests of what is now southern Mexico. The Olmecs, considered one of the first complex civilizations in the Americas, were likely the earliest people to cultivate the cacao tree. Though much of their history is shrouded in mystery, archaeologists believe the Olmecs used cacao in rituals, and possibly as a ceremonial drink consumed by elite leaders or shamans. It was no ordinary refreshment. It was a vessel for spiritual power. But it was with the Maya civilization that cacao truly became a divine gift. The Maya, whose empire spanned much of Central America from around 250 to 900 CE, worshipped cacao as a sacred plant bestowed by the gods. According to their mythology, cacao was a gift from the gods of creation, part of the very foundation of human life. The Popol Vuh, a sacred Maya text, describes the gods forming humans from maize and cacao, binding them to the natural world. Cacao was reserved for important moments. Priests offered it during religious ceremonies. Nobles drank it during elaborate feasts. It was believed to invigorate the spirit and open a gateway to the divine. Served cold and mixed with chili, spices, or cornmeal, the cacao drink was rich, intense, and energizing. Often it was poured from vessel to vessel to create a frothy foam, a sign of prestige and quality. But cacao's value went even deeper than ritual. Maya markets used cacao beans as currency. A few beans could buy a tamale. 100 could buy a turkey. People stored them like money, traded them, and even made counterfeit versions from clay. To the Maya, chocolate wasn't a treat. It was life, power, wealth, and worship all in one. It was the drink of the gods, flowing through the veins of kings and priests. And its bitter, intoxicating taste marked the beginning of one of the most remarkable culinary journeys in human history. Among the Maya, cacao was more than a beverage. It was a living symbol of divine order, woven into the very fabric of daily life and cosmic belief. This small, bitter bean from the jungle was thought to be a sacred substance, capable of connecting mortals to the gods, the earth, and the afterlife. In every major Maya city, from Tikal to Copan, cacao was present at the most important moments of life. When rulers were crowned, cacao was poured. When marriages were sealed, it was drunk by both bride and groom. And when the dead were laid to rest, vessels of cacao accompanied them into the tomb, offerings meant to nourish their souls in the next world. Cacao was commonly consumed during religious ceremonies, often by the priestly and elite classes. These drinks were not sweet, nor were they taken casually. They were blended with chili peppers, maize, vanilla, and sometimes even blood, a powerful combination intended to invigorate the spirit and induce visions. It was believed that drinking cacao could bring one closer to the divine, opening the mind to prophecy or sacred insight. The Maya also believed cacao trees were sacred. Their curved branches and brightly coloured pods symbolized life, fertility, and abundance. In art, cacao often appeared alongside gods and ancestral spirits. On painted ceramics and carved stelae, you can see scenes of kings offering cacao to deities, or gods themselves emerging from the pods as if born of divine fruit. But cacao's role extended beyond religion. It was a staple of the social and economic world. Hosting a guest, you served cacao, negotiating peace, you drank cacao together. For the Maya, to share cacao was to recognize shared humanity, an unspoken contract of trust, respect, and elevated purpose. Even in the homes of the wealthy, cacao drinking was ceremonial. Special vessels were used, beautifully painted cups, often marked with glyphs identifying the owner and the specific purpose of the drink. These weren't just dishes, they were heirlooms, crafted with care and reverence. The reverence for cacao shaped the Maya identity. It was not just consumed, it was celebrated, revered, and trusted as a bridge between realms. In a world ruled by ritual and cosmic cycles, cacao was the drink that kept the universe in balance. Centuries after the Maya, another mighty civilization would rise and elevate cacao even further: the Aztecs. By the time Hernán Cortés and the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 1500s, cacao was not just a spiritual symbol or luxury item. In the Aztec Empire, it was an institution, used as money, medicine, and a royal indulgence. The Aztecs didn't grow cacao in the cool, dry climate of their capital, Tenochtitlan. Instead, they acquired it through trade or tribute. Conquered provinces in warmer southern regions were required to send cacao beans as payment to the imperial center. Tons of beans flowed into the empire's coffers, stored in granaries like modern banks. Each bean had value. A small rabbit could cost 10 beans. A turkey hen might cost 100. Servants were paid in cacao. Debts were settled with it. To counterfeit a cacao bean, to hollow one out and fill it with dirt, was a serious crime. In Aztec society, cacao was as valuable as gold. But its worth went beyond economics. Cacao, known as xocolatl, was revered as a warrior's drink. It was consumed by nobles, priests, and military leaders, never by commoners. Prepared with water, chili, and sometimes maize, it was believed to energize the body and sharpen the mind before battle. Emperor Moctezuma II is said to have consumed as many as 50 cups a day, believing it to be an aphrodisiac and a source of strength. Cacao was also a key element in religious ceremonies. Offerings were made to deities like Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent god who, according to legend, gave cacao to humanity after stealing it from paradise. It was believed that cacao had divine origins, and drinking it properly was a sacred act. In Aztec culture, cacao represented wealth, war, worship, and royalty. It was a seed of power, earned, stolen, traded, and honoured. But all of this would soon collide with European conquest. When Spanish eyes first saw the cacao bean, they didn't recognise its value. But that would change. The bitter drink of warriors and kings was about to cross the ocean, where it would be forever transformed, sweetened, commodified, and woven into a global obsession. When Hernán Cortés and his band of conquistadors first arrived in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan in 1519, they encountered a world both foreign and magnificent. Towering temples, floating gardens, and bustling markets stunned the Europeans. But among all the wonders, one thing caught their attention again and again: the peculiar use of a dark, bitter drink made from crushed beans. The Spanish watched as Moctezuma II was served cup after cup of xocolatl in golden vessels. They observed warriors, nobles, and priests treating the substance with reverence. At first, they found it unpleasant, strange, unsweetened, spicy. Some even called it unpalatable. But they also noticed something else: the energy it seemed to grant, the alertness it sparked, and the symbolic power it carried in every corner of Aztec life. Once the conquest was complete and the empire fell, Cortés brought more than gold and silver back to Spain. He brought cacao beans. He brought the knowledge of how to grind, mix, and drink them. And with that, chocolate entered Europe. At first, it remained a curiosity of the Spanish court, an exotic treasure of the New World. Monasteries began to prepare it in the traditional way, for nobles and royals only. But the European palate was different. Over time, the chili and maize were replaced with something new: sugar. Sugar changed everything. The addition of sweeteners to the bitter cacao drink sparked a culinary revolution. Suddenly, what had been a sacred, spicy brew of warriors became a sweet indulgence, something seductive, luxurious, and deeply fashionable. In Spain, and soon across Europe, chocolate was no longer a tool of ritual or tribute. It became a marker of wealth and sophistication. Aristocrats sipped it at salons. Royalty demanded it at their tables. It was still prepared as a drink, usually hot, but the flavour had softened. The rituals were replaced with recipes. The power once tied to gods and warriors now belonged to European elite. But even as chocolate delighted the palates of kings and queens, it carried a new bitterness, one not from taste, but from the human cost. To feed Europe's growing hunger for cacao and sugar, colonial plantations expanded, and behind them, a new system of exploitation and slavery would begin. The drink of the gods had entered a new world, and it would never be the same. By the 17th century, chocolate had evolved from a sacred Mesoamerican ritual to a fashionable European delicacy. But behind this sweet transformation lay a growing darkness. The union of cacao and sugar, a pairing that delighted European palates, also became one of the driving forces behind one of history's most brutal systems, the transatlantic slave trade. As European demand for chocolate grew, so did the need for raw cacao. The lush equatorial regions of South America, Central America, and the Caribbean offered the perfect climate to grow the cacao tree. But harvesting it was labor-intensive. Cacao pods had to be picked by hand, split open, and the beans fermented, dried, and roasted. The same was true for sugarcane, another demanding crop. To maximize profit, colonial powers turned to slavery. The Portuguese, Spanish, French, Dutch, and British all participated in building plantation economies, fueled by enslaved labor. Millions of Africans were captured, shipped across the Atlantic, and forced to work under brutal conditions on plantations in Brazil, the Caribbean, and later, West Africa. Many would spend their lives cultivating cacao and sugar, never tasting the sweet confections their labor created. The human cost was staggering. In the pursuit of chocolate and sugar, families were torn apart, cultures were erased, and entire generations suffered. Yet in the drawing rooms of London, Paris, and Madrid, aristocrats sipped hot chocolate unaware, or uninterested, in the lives behind the beans. The commodification of cacao marked a turning point. It was no longer a sacred offering. It was a global product, something to be traded, taxed, and turned into profit. And as the industrial age approached, the demand would only grow. What began as a spiritual drink, crafted with reverence and ceremony, had now become entangled in empire and exploitation. The taste that had once symbolized divine connection now left a bitter residue, one of blood, suffering, and systemic injustice. Yet the allure of chocolate only deepened. Its association with luxury, love, and pleasure grew stronger, while its history of labor and suffering was quietly buried beneath layers of sugar and cream. The story of chocolate's rise was no longer just about flavor or ritual. It was about power, profit, and the people sacrificed along the way. For centuries, chocolate remained a liquid luxury, served in royal courts and elegant salons. But as Europe entered the Industrial Revolution, chocolate was about to undergo another transformation, one that would forever change its form, its audience, and its place in the world. The early 1800s saw a wave of invention. Mechanization and mass production were reshaping everything from textiles to food. And in 1828, a Dutch chemist named Coenraad Johannes van Houten developed a revolutionary process. Using a hydraulic press, he extracted much of the natural fat, the cacao butter, from roasted cacao beans. What remained was a dry cake, which could be ground into a fine powder. This powder dissolved more easily in water and could be blended with sugar more smoothly, making chocolate cheaper, lighter, and easier to produce. This invention gave birth to what we now call Dutch cocoa, and it paved the way for solid chocolate. In 1847, the British company Fry & Sons took things a step further. By combining cacao powder, cacao butter, and sugar, they created the world's first modern chocolate bar, a smooth, moldable, and portable version of what had always been a drink. For the first time, chocolate could be held in the hand, not just sipped from a cup. Then came the Swiss. In the 1870s, Daniel Peter introduced milk chocolate by adding condensed milk to the mixture, creating a creamier, sweeter version of the classic bar. His friend and rival, Rodolphe Lindt, invented the conching machine, which slowly churned chocolate for hours, refining its texture and giving it the silky smoothness we now associate with high-quality chocolate. These innovations turned chocolate from a luxury into a mass-market product. With lower prices and improved texture, chocolate was no longer reserved for royalty. It entered shops, factories, and lunchboxes across Europe, and soon after, the United States. Companies like Cadbury, Nestlé, and Hershey industrialized chocolate on a scale never seen before. Packaging became colorful and playful. Advertising emphasized joy, indulgence, and childhood wonder. But in making chocolate sweet, accessible, and solid, something of its origin was forgotten. The divine drink of gods had become a snack. Delicious, yes, but stripped of its ancient power and ritual. Still, a new chapter had begun, one where chocolate would become beloved worldwide. By the dawn of the 20th century, chocolate had taken root across the globe, not just as a delicacy, but as an industry. What began as a sacred brew among ancient civilizations had become a worldwide phenomenon, driven by factories, marketing, and the unstoppable forces of global capitalism. In the United States, chocolate took a uniquely American turn with Milton Hershey. In the late 1800s, Hershey applied mass production methods to chocolate, much like Henry Ford would later do with automobiles. His factory in Pennsylvania produced affordable milk chocolate for the average American, not just the elite. By 1900, the Hershey bar was born, and with it, a new American love affair with chocolate. But chocolate was no longer just a product, it was becoming a symbol. Soldiers carried it into war, children traded it on playgrounds. It appeared in cookbooks, holiday rituals, and romantic gestures. Valentine's Day, Halloween, Easter, each adopted chocolate as its unofficial mascot. Its sweetness now spoke to love, comfort, and nostalgia. Meanwhile, international companies expanded cacao cultivation to meet demand. West Africa, particularly Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, became global hubs for cacao farming, surpassing Latin America. The same regions that had once endured colonial rule and slavery were now supplying over 70% of the world's cacao, often under exploitative conditions. Even in modern times, labor abuses, including child labor and poverty-level wages, persist in many cacao-growing regions. Yet despite its tangled roots, chocolate's popularity only grew. In Japan, it became a refined art. Small, exquisite bonbons, gifted with ritual precision. In Switzerland, it was a matter of national pride, with brands like Toblerone and Lindt defining premium quality. In Mexico, chocolate returned to its ancient roots, used in traditional dishes like mole, where bitter and savory flavors coexist. Global chocolate culture was, and still is, a paradox. Universal, yet personal. A product born of indigenous ceremony, transformed by empire, refined by industry, and then embraced in 1,000 unique ways across continents. From the Andes to Antwerp, from Ghana to Geneva, chocolate had become part of the human story. And even though few stopped to wonder where it came from, every bite carries the flavor of history, sweet, bitter, and everywhere in between. In the whirlwind of industrial growth and global expansion, chocolate's ancient origins were largely forgotten. What once carried divine meaning and ceremonial weight had become, for many, just another snack, delicious, convenient, and sold by the millions. But in recent decades, a new movement has begun to stir. A rediscovery of chocolate's roots and a return to the bean. The craft chocolate movement began in earnest in the early 2000s, inspired by trends in coffee, wine, and slow food. Artisans and chocolatiers across the world started asking, where does our chocolate come from? Who grows it? What does it taste like before it's buried beneath sugar and additives? The answers led them back to the cacao bean. Unlike industrial chocolate, which is often blended from beans sourced in bulk, craft chocolate focuses on single-origin cacao, preserving the unique flavors of specific regions, soils, and fermentation styles. Beans from Madagascar might taste fruity and citrusy, while those from Ecuador could carry floral or nutty notes. Chocolate, it turned out, had terroir, just like wine. This reawakening wasn't just about flavor, it was also about ethics. With greater awareness came concern over how cacao is produced. Documentaries and investigations revealed ongoing labor abuses, including child labor and unfair wages on cacao farms. In response, many craft chocolate makers began working directly with farmers, paying premium prices for high-quality, ethically grown beans. Labels like Fair Trade, Direct Trade, and Rainforest Alliance emerged, each striving to create a more just and sustainable supply chain. Meanwhile, chefs and food historians began reviving ancient Mesoamerican uses of cacao. In parts of Mexico and Guatemala, traditional drinks made with cacao, chili, and maize regained popularity. Indigenous communities shared recipes passed down for generations, reminding the world that chocolate was not invented in a factory, but in a forest. Museums, books, and culinary tours followed. People began to see chocolate not just as candy, but as culture, rich in heritage, struggle, and story. The world had changed chocolate, but chocolate, in its essence, had never changed. It was still the fruit of a tree, grown by hand, prepared with care, and shared with meaning. And for those who cared to listen, chocolate once again began to speak, not just in sweetness, but in memory. Today, chocolate is everywhere. At celebrations, in vending machines, inside pastries and gourmet kitchens alike. It's a symbol of love, luxury, and comfort. But beneath its creamy surface lies a history that's anything but simple. It's a story of gods and empires, of joy and exploitation, of ritual and reinvention. Chocolate, perhaps more than any other food, is a mirror held up to civilization itself. From the sacred ceremonies of the Maya to the bitter brews of Aztec warriors. From the hands of enslaved laborers on colonial plantations to the gilded salons of European nobility. From wartime rations to Valentine's Day traditions, chocolate has journeyed alongside humanity, reshaping itself at every turn. Its legacy is layered. On one side, chocolate represents ingenuity, resilience, and cultural fusion. It is the perfect example of how ingredients from one continent can meet techniques from another to create something entirely new. It has inspired poetry, science, and innovation, from the chemistry of tempering to the artistry of flavor balancing. But on the other side, it holds a shadow. Much of the modern chocolate industry still depends on the labor of impoverished farmers, many of whom have never tasted the chocolate bars their beans help produce. Despite awareness campaigns and ethical certifications, problems like deforestation, underpayment, and child labor remain ongoing concerns in the cacao supply chain. Chocolate is also a story of forgotten voices. The indigenous peoples who first revered cacao saw it as sacred. Their traditions, silenced by colonization, are only now being rediscovered, and their contributions acknowledged. Each time we bite into a truffle or sip a cup of hot cocoa, we engage, knowingly or not, with that deep and often painful history. And yet, for all its contradictions, chocolate continues to unite people. Across languages, borders, and beliefs, it brings joy. It comforts, it celebrates, it endures. Perhaps that is chocolate's greatest legacy, not just its flavor, but its ability to evolve, to adapt, and to survive the rise and fall of civilizations. From ritual to recipe, from seed to symbol, chocolate has always meant more than it seemed. It is, in the end, not just a treat, but a story, one that even now we are still writing. In the early decades of the 19th century, the United States was a young and growing nation, restless in its ambitions. Its population was surging, and white settlers were pushing outward, hungry for farmland, gold, and opportunity. To many, the promise of the American frontier was a divine right. But to fulfill that dream, they looked westward, not into wilderness, as they imagined, but into lands already deeply rooted in memory, culture, and life. Those lands belonged to Native American nations. Among the most prominent were the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole, tribes with sophisticated political systems, written languages, newspapers, and schools. These were not scattered bands of nomads. They were sovereign communities, many of which had long tried to coexist with the United States on legal and diplomatic terms. The Cherokee Nation in particular had adopted numerous elements of American society in hopes of preserving their autonomy. They drafted a constitution modelled after that of the US, practiced agriculture, and many converted to Christianity. They published a bilingual newspaper. They even sent delegates to Washington. But to white settlers and politicians, assimilation was never enough. What they wanted was the land. Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and other southern states began encroaching more aggressively into native territories. They passed laws invalidating tribal governance, nullifying native property rights, and pressuring the federal government to act. The discovery of gold in northern Georgia only heightened the urgency. The land, they argued, was too valuable to remain in native hands. President Andrew Jackson, a former general and staunch advocate for removal, stepped forward with a solution. Clear the east of native nations entirely. Relocate them beyond the Mississippi River to a place where they would no longer obstruct the march of cotton plantations and white settlement. This was not merely policy, it was ideology. Manifest Destiny, though not yet named, pulsed through the veins of the American project. The belief that white Americans were destined to expand from coast to coast came at the expense of anyone in their way. And in the 1830s, that meant entire nations of people. Thus, the stage was set, not for progress, but for one of the most sorrowful and shameful journeys in American history, the Trail of Tears. On May 28, 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act, legislation that would forever alter the lives of tens of thousands of Native Americans. Though cloaked in the language of fairness and voluntary exchange, the act marked the beginning of a calculated and relentless campaign to remove native tribes from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States. The act authorized the president to negotiate treaties with native nations, exchanging their lands east of the Mississippi River for territory in what was then called Indian Territory, an expanse of land that would later become Oklahoma. Supporters of the law argued that it would protect native peoples from extinction by placing them far from white encroachment. But in truth, it was a land grab, dressed in the rhetoric of protection. Andrew Jackson, a military hero celebrated for his brutal campaigns against the Creek and Seminole, saw removal as a logical continuation of American expansion. He claimed native peoples could not live in harmony with white settlers. Removal, he argued, was not only beneficial, it was inevitable. They have neither the intelligence, the industry, the moral habits, nor the desire of improvement, he once said of native nations. They must perish, or they must abandon their habitations and wander far into the wilderness. Congress was divided, but the bill passed, narrowly. In the Senate, it cleared by just 3 votes. In the House of Representatives, it passed by a margin of 5. These slim victories were enough to set into motion one of the most tragic episodes in American history. Some tribes agreed to relocate, fearing war or further loss. Others held out, believing the promises of treaties that offered money, supplies, and safe passage. But these promises would prove hollow for many. In practice, the removal process was chaotic, cruel, and often violently enforced. What the law claimed would be a peaceful transfer quickly became a nightmare of broken agreements, corruption, and forced marches. Entire communities were uprooted, homes burned, crops destroyed. Soldiers arrived at the doorsteps of families, ordering them to pack what they could carry. Behind them came settlers, ready to claim the cleared land. The Indian Removal Act didn't just redraw maps, it severed ancestral ties, destroyed lives, and exposed a bitter truth. American expansion was built not only on hope, but on heartbreak. While many tribes faced mounting pressure to sign removal treaties, the Cherokee Nation chose a different path, one grounded not in weapons, but in words and law. Determined to defend their sovereignty, the Cherokee took their fight to the courts of the United States, using the very legal system that had been used against them. Under the leadership of Principal Chief John Ross, the Cherokee drafted a constitution, created a formal government, and asserted their right to exist as a sovereign nation within US borders. They believed that by proving their civilization and political structure mirrored that of the American Republic, they could protect their territory. Their resistance culminated in two landmark Supreme Court cases. In Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, 1831, the Cherokee sought a federal injunction against laws passed by the state of Georgia that stripped them of their rights and lands. The court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled that the Cherokee were not a foreign nation and thus had no standing to sue, a devastating blow. But the next year, a second case would shift the tide. In Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, the court ruled in favor of the Cherokee, declaring that the state of Georgia had no authority to impose laws on Cherokee territory. Marshall affirmed that the federal government alone could negotiate with sovereign native nations. For a brief moment, justice appeared to be on the Cherokee's side. But President Andrew Jackson reportedly responded with chilling defiance. John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. Whether he actually said those exact words remains debated, but his actions left no doubt. Jackson refused to uphold the court's ruling, and Georgia continued to ignore it. The Constitution had spoken, but political will refused to listen. The Cherokee, clinging to hope, still resisted signing removal treaties, but division crept in. A small faction within the Cherokee, led by Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, believed removal was inevitable and signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835 without the authorization of the Cherokee government. That treaty, passed by a narrow vote in the US Senate, sealed the fate of the Cherokee Nation. Despite the protests of the majority, it was declared binding. And so the Cherokee fight for justice ended, not with a gavel, but with the sound of soldiers preparing to march. In the spring of 1838, under orders from President Martin Van Buren, thousands of federal troops and state militias descended upon Cherokee lands. The time for negotiation was over. The Treaty of New Echota, signed by a minority of Cherokee without the consent of their nation, had been ratified by Congress. Removal was now official policy, and the military was sent to carry it out by force. Across Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Alabama, Cherokee families were torn from their homes with little warning. Soldiers arrived at farms and cabins with bayonets and orders. Families were given only moments to gather belongings, sometimes nothing more than the clothes on their backs. Their homes were looted and burned. Crops were left to rot in the fields. Churches, schools, and burial grounds, all abandoned. More than 16,000 Cherokee were rounded up and placed in military stockades. These makeshift camps were overcrowded and unsanitary, with little food, dirty water, and no shelter from the elements. Disease spread rapidly. Measles, dysentery, and whooping cough took a heavy toll even before the march began. Some groups were moved immediately under armed guard. Others, held in the sweltering summer heat, were forced to wait until autumn, when travel conditions were considered more favourable. But cold rains, early snow, and inadequate supplies would make the journey even more deadly. The Cherokee called the route Nuna Dal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. Roughly 100 to 200 miles stretched between their homes and the so-called Indian Territory. The march was slow, harsh, and humiliating. They walked through mud and snow, across frozen rivers, over mountains and prairies. The elderly collapsed. Children died in their mothers' arms. Entire families vanished along the trail, buried in shallow, unmarked graves by the roadside. Some tried to maintain dignity, singing prayers, carrying sacred objects, recording names of the lost. But the weight of grief was unbearable. Hunger gnawed at their strength. Winter pierced their thin clothing. Guards showed little mercy. By the time the last group arrived in what is now Oklahoma in early 1839, it's estimated that over 4,000 Cherokee had died, nearly a quarter of their entire population. This was not simply a relocation. It was a death march, a forced erasure of identity, home, and hope. When the last group of Cherokee reached Indian Territory in March of 1839, the journey was over, but the suffering was not. The losses endured along the Trail of Tears extended far beyond the 4,000 lives claimed by disease, exposure, and starvation. What died on that trail was more than people. It was a way of life, a spiritual connection to land, and the cultural continuity of an entire nation. The trauma echoed through generations. Survivors arrived weakened, broken, and grieving. They had lost elders who carried traditional knowledge, children who had represented future hope, leaders who had defended their people with all the strength they had. There were no ceremonies for the dead, no time for mourning. The land they had been forced to settle was unfamiliar and often hostile. The promises made by the US government of protection, supplies, and fertile land were inconsistently honoured or ignored altogether. The physical wounds were matched by the emotional ones. The Cherokee had been a proud nation with schools, printing presses, and a constitution. They had trusted the legal system, believing that law would protect them. But their trust had been betrayed, their justice denied, their rights erased. Among the survivors, divisions deepened. The treaty party, those who had signed the Treaty of New Echota, were viewed by many as traitors. In June of 1839, just months after the relocation, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot were assassinated by fellow Cherokee in a wave of retribution. The unity of the nation, already battered by removal, now fractured further under the weight of internal conflict. And yet, even amidst devastation, the Cherokee endured. They rebuilt schools. They re-established their government. They began printing newspapers again. They held on to their language, their stories, their faith. The resilience that had once carried them through legal courts and diplomatic struggles now became the foundation of survival. Still, the scars of removal ran deep, and they remain today. The Trail of Tears is not just a chapter in a history book. It's a living memory carried in families, in oral traditions, and in the soul of a people who were forced to leave everything behind. And in that memory, there is sorrow, but also strength. While the Cherokee Trail of Tears is the most widely remembered, it was not the only forced removal. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 targeted multiple native nations, each with their own languages, traditions, and lands, and each endured their own version of exile, suffering, and loss. The Choctaw were the first to be removed. Beginning in 1831, thousands of Choctaw were forced from their homelands in Mississippi and Alabama. Most traveled on foot, without wagons or adequate supplies. As they marched through freezing rains and swollen rivers, hundreds died. A Choctaw chief later called it a trail of tears and death, a phrase that would echo in history. The Creek Nation, once powerful in the southeast, was next. After years of broken treaties and violent clashes with settlers and militias, they too were rounded up and driven westward. In 1836, over 15,000 Creek were removed, many in chains. Thousands perished along the way, while others were sold into slavery or scattered from their kin. The Chickasaw negotiated payment for their lands before removal, but their journey was no less brutal. Delays in receiving compensation left them without resources, and hundreds died from disease and starvation during the move west. The Seminole of Florida resisted most fiercely. From 1835 to 1842, they waged guerrilla war against US forces in the swamps and forests. Leaders like Osceola became symbols of resistance, but even the Seminole could not withstand the weight of US military power forever. Thousands were captured or killed. Others were forcibly marched to Indian Territory, while a small group fled deep into the Everglades, where their descendants remain today. In all, over 100,000 Native Americans from multiple nations were displaced during the removal era. The government called it policy, the settlers called it progress, but for Native peoples, it was catastrophe. Each nation's trail was different, but all shared the same themes: betrayal, suffering, and loss. Sacred homelands were stripped away. Cultural centres were shattered. The bonds of community, family, and memory were stretched to the brink. And yet, these nations carried their songs, their languages, and their spirit with them into a new land that did not welcome them, but where they would find ways to survive. When the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole finally arrived in Indian Territory, what is now the state of Oklahoma, they found a land that was nothing like the one they'd been forced to leave. The federal government had promised fertile soil, safety from further encroachment, and permanent ownership of their new homes. But those promises, like so many before, would prove fragile. The land was unfamiliar, the climate harsher. For many, it was difficult to grow crops or rebuild homes using traditional methods. Winters were bitter and unpredictable. Summer droughts scorched the earth. Communities were scattered, with many families arriving months apart, or not at all. Diseases followed them: cholera, smallpox, influenza. Grief lived in every new settlement. The government aid that was promised, livestock, tools, food, and money, often arrived late or not at all. Corruption plagued the system. Contractors cut corners, supplies were spoiled. Resources meant to help resettled families start over were siphoned off by middlemen or bureaucrats with little oversight. Worse still, the land that had been guaranteed as a permanent Indian homeland was soon under threat. As settlers pushed westward and the borders of US states crept closer, new pressures emerged. Railroads began to carve through the land. Treaties were rewritten or ignored under pressure or manipulation. What had been set aside as sovereign territory began to shrink once again. Despite these hardships, the nations worked to rebuild. The Cherokee re-established their capital in Tahlequah and rebuilt schools and institutions. The Choctaw and Chickasaw reorganized their governments. New constitutions were written. Councils met. Churches were built. Farming resumed. Communities began to heal, not by forgetting, but by enduring. And yet, even in Indian Territory, the shadow of removal loomed. Every promise made to protect their new homeland was vulnerable to the same forces that had driven them from their original lands: greed, expansion, and disregard. The land that was promised became a temporary refuge in a nation still unwilling to see native people as permanent, rightful inhabitants. Though many believed they had finally found peace, history would soon prove otherwise. The story of the Trail of Tears didn't end in Indian Territory. It simply turned the page to another long chapter in the struggle for survival, sovereignty, and respect. For decades after the forced removals, the Trail of Tears lived mostly in silence, spoken about in whispers, passed down through family stories, rarely acknowledged in textbooks or politics. It was a wound left open, a shared pain carried quietly by native communities, too often ignored by the nation that had caused it. Yet the memory survived. In Cherokee homes, elders told the story of the march west, of the cold, of the hunger, of the lost. Songs were sung in mourning. Ceremonies were held in remembrance. Oral history kept the names of those who walked and those who did not alive. The land remembered too. Old trails, shallow graves, and surviving documents marked the route like a scar across the heart of a continent. It was not just a trail of sorrow, it was a trail of survival. The resilience shown by native nations after removal defied the expectations of those who had tried to erase them. In the decades that followed, the Cherokee, Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole would not only rebuild, they would thrive. They formed new governments, ran schools, printed newspapers, and preserved languages and spiritual traditions. Against the odds, they endured. Still, the silence from outside their communities remained. Not until the late 20th century did wider America begin to reckon, even faintly, with the tragedy of the Trail of Tears. Activists and tribal leaders worked to reinsert the story into national memory. Memorials were erected, commemorative trails were marked, school curriculums were slowly updated. The phrase Trail of Tears became a recognized term, not just among historians, but in the national consciousness. But acknowledgement is not the same as justice. The effects of removal are still felt. The disconnection from ancestral lands, the historical trauma, and the legacy of broken promises continue to shape the realities of native communities today. Yet through every hardship, the strength of these nations endures. The same spirit that guided them through forests, across rivers, and into exile still lives on in language revival programs, cultural preservation efforts, and the stories told around fires and kitchen tables. The Trail of Tears is not just about what was lost, it's about what was carried forward. Faith, memory, and the unyielding will to survive. Today, the Trail of Tears is remembered not only as a historical event, but as a living memory, a reminder of injustice, of resilience, and of the strength it takes to carry a people forward when the world turns against them. The route that once echoed with footsteps of grief now serves as a sacred path of remembrance. Across the United States, monuments, trails, and museums mark the journey. The Trail of Tears. National Historic Trail, designated by Congress in 1987, stretches over 5,000 miles across 9 states, tracing the paths taken by those who were forced to march westward. It winds through forests, fields, and quiet towns, inviting visitors to walk, if only for a moment, in the footsteps of those who endured it. But true remembrance goes beyond monuments. For the descendants of those who walked the trail, memory lives in community, language, and ceremony. Tribal nations continue to honor their ancestors through annual memorial rides, storytelling gatherings, and language revitalization programs. What was once a story nearly silenced is now reclaimed and spoken with pride. Schools now teach it, films portray it, authors and poets give voice to the sorrow and strength of that era. And native youth grow up knowing that their identity is rooted in more than survival. It is rooted in courage, resistance, and continuity. Yet, there is still work to do. The Trail of Tears stands as a challenge to how history is told and remembered. It asks us to confront the cost of expansion, the cruelty behind policy, and the ongoing struggles faced by Indigenous peoples. It reminds us that progress without humanity is not progress at all. It is erasure. To honor the Trail of Tears is to do more than look back. It is to listen, to learn, and to uplift the voices that once were pushed aside. It is to recognize that the story of America is incomplete without its native nations, not just in the past, but in the present, and in every chapter yet to come. And so we remember, not just with sorrow, but with deep respect. Because even in the face of betrayal and exile, the people walked forward, and they did not vanish. They endured. In the biting cold of early 1692, Salem Village, Massachusetts, was a place thick with unease. Tucked into the harsh New England wilderness, this Puritan settlement was more than just a collection of farms and meeting houses. It was a community teetering on the edge of spiritual and social collapse. The people of Salem believed they were God's chosen, placed in a wild and dangerous land to carve out a righteous life. But beneath their devotion simmered years of fear, tension, and division. The Puritans lived under a strict religious code. They believed in an invisible world filled with angels and demons. The devil, they were taught, was not a metaphor, but a real and active force. Witches, they believed, could sign the devil's book, casting spells and corrupting the innocent. To question this was to question Scripture. To doubt a minister was to challenge God. And Salem had no shortage of spiritual pressure. Reverend Samuel Parris, the village's minister, was a deeply polarizing figure. Harsh, suspicious, and often paranoid, he saw signs of sin everywhere. His sermons thundered with warnings of damnation and the devil's work. He divided the congregation with his fire and brimstone preaching, creating deep rifts among neighbors and families. Beyond the pulpit, Salem faced economic and political strain. A long-running feud between Salem Village and the wealthier Salem town caused constant tension. Land disputes were common, and the boundaries between property, belief, and personal grievance were often blurred. Old resentments lingered just beneath the surface. To make matters worse, the surrounding wilderness was a source of terror. The memory of brutal Native American attacks during King Philip's War was still fresh. Crops had failed the year before. Smallpox had swept through the region. In the Puritan mind, these disasters were not chance. They were punishment for hidden sins. It was in this atmosphere of religious anxiety, political rivalry, and survivalist dread that a group of young girls would begin to act strangely. Their sudden fits, wild accusations, and cries of witchcraft would not be dismissed as childish games. Not here, not in Salem. Because in Salem, the devil was real. And in 1692, the villagers believed he had come to visit. It began, as many tragedies do, with children. In January of 1692, two young girls in Salem village, 9-year-old Betty Paris and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams, began to behave in alarming ways. They screamed, thrashed, and contorted their bodies into unnatural positions. They barked like dogs, hurled objects, and spoke in gibberish. When reprimanded, they wailed in pain and claimed they were being pinched or pricked by invisible forces. Their afflictions confounded the adults around them. Reverend Samuel Paris, Betty's father, initially saw the behaviour as disturbing, but perhaps curable. A local doctor, William Griggs, examined the girls and gave a chilling diagnosis. They were under an evil hand. In a deeply religious and superstitious community like Salem, that meant only one thing: witchcraft. Soon, other girls began to display the same symptoms. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard joined the afflicted circle. Their fits escalated, drawing the attention of the entire village. These girls were not from the fringes of society. They were daughters of prominent families, respected members of the Puritan order. That gave their words weight. When pressed to name the cause of their suffering, the girls did something that would change the fate of the entire colony. They pointed fingers. The first to be accused was Tituba, an enslaved woman of Caribbean origin in the Paris household. She was a convenient target, foreign, non-white, and associated with stories and rituals that seemed exotic and suspect to Puritan eyes. Alongside her, the girls named two other local women: Sarah Good, a poor and often homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, who had scandalized the community by refusing to attend church and marrying her servant. 3 women, each vulnerable in different ways, were suddenly the focus of an entire town's suspicion. They were arrested and jailed. For the villagers, this was a spiritual emergency. If witches walked among them, they had to be identified and purged. What had begun as an unexplained illness in a single household now spiraled into full-blown panic. And as the accusations spread, no one, not neighbours, not friends, not even family, would be safe from suspicion. Salem had opened the door to fear, and it would not be easily closed. In the early months of 1692, as more villagers fell into hysterics and more names were whispered in fear, Salem's courts began relying on a kind of evidence never before used in any English-speaking legal system: spectral evidence. It would become the most controversial and damning tool of the trials, and the most dangerous. Spectral evidence was based on the belief that a witch could send her spirit, or spectre, to torment victims from afar. The afflicted girls would scream in court, claiming to see the accused person's ghost pinching, choking, or stabbing them, while the accused stood silently in front of them, often in disbelief. To the Puritan mind, this wasn't imagination or performance. It was considered valid proof of a pact with the devil. When the accused denied their guilt, they were accused of lying. And when they stayed silent, that too was seen as an admission of guilt. Those who confessed, however, were often spared execution, especially if they named other witches. This perverse incentive caused a wave of coerced confessions. Tituba, the enslaved woman accused first, confessed under pressure. She claimed that a tall man from Boston, clearly meant to suggest the devil, had visited her and promised her freedom if she served him. She described strange creatures, flying spirits, and even said she had seen a witch's book filled with signatures, implying that others in the village had also made deals with Satan. Her testimony was graphic, theatrical, and terrifying. Whether Tituba's confession was strategic, survival-driven, or partly imagined remains debated. But it had a powerful effect. It validated the girl's accusations and stoked public fear. If witches were real, and if they moved unseen, then anyone could be guilty. Soon, more confessions followed. Some extracted under duress, others offered in hope of mercy. Those who refused to confess were often treated more harshly than those who admitted guilt. The line between truth and fantasy vanished in the candle-lit courtrooms. Hysteria drowned reason. Ministers urged caution, but too often their voices were ignored. Jails filled with the accused, farmers, midwives, churchgoers, even children. The foundations of justice in Salem were crumbling. A town once governed by scripture and order now answered to visions, screams, and shadows. And still, the accusations grew. By the spring of 1692, the accusations had overwhelmed Salem's jails. What began as a local disturbance had spread into a full-blown judicial crisis, with more than 100 people imprisoned and the colony struggling to process the chaos. In response, Massachusetts Governor William Phips established a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, meaning to hear and determine, specifically to handle the witchcraft cases. The court convened in Salem town, and its judges included respected men like William Stoughton, Samuel Sewall, and John Hathorne. But even their experience and stature couldn't shield the proceedings from hysteria. The rules of evidence bent to fear. Spectral evidence was accepted. Hearsay was common, and doubt, even skepticism, was considered dangerous. The first to be formally tried and executed was Bridget Bishop, a woman long suspected by neighbours of being unruly and outspoken. She wore bright clothing, ran a tavern, and had been accused of witchcraft years before, making her a perfect scapegoat. During her trial in June, the afflicted girls claimed to see her spectre pinching and mocking them in the courtroom. When she denied all charges, her resistance was taken as proof of guilt. Bridget was convicted swiftly and hanged on June 10, 1692. She would not be the last. With her death, the machinery of accusation, trial, and execution accelerated. Week by week, more prisoners were brought before the judges. Some were pillars of their communities, church members, midwives, landowners. Others were beggars, widows, or former servants. What united them was not guilt, but suspicion, and in many cases, the misfortune of being disliked, envied, or simply misunderstood. The accused stood before a court where they had little hope. Their fate often depended on the theatrics of their accusers or the political winds of the day. Those who confessed and accused others were usually spared. Those who maintained innocence were more likely to be hanged. Fear fueled everything. Families turned on each other. Neighbours testified to save themselves. Ministers cautioned restraint, but their voices were drowned out by cries for purification. And overhead, a gallows was built on Proctor's Ledge, just outside Salem. It waited in silence as the town below fed it names, one trial at a time. By the height of the summer of 1692, Salem was no longer a town. It was a furnace, burning with fear, accusation, and righteous fury. The witch trials had moved beyond Salem village and Salem town, spreading like wildfire across neighbouring communities. Ipswich, Andover, Gloucester, and others were soon gripped by the same fever. Accusations multiplied, jails overflowed, no one was safe. The accused came from all walks of life. Some were outsiders, beggars, former slaves, women without families. Others were deeply rooted in the community, church deacons, wealthy farmers, and even former accusers. Once the machinery of suspicion began to churn, it spared no one. Families were torn apart. Husbands and wives accused one another. Children testified against parents. Friends betrayed friends. Even those who questioned the legitimacy of the trials became targets. To doubt the existence of witches was, in the minds of some, to align with them. Nowhere was this madness more visible than in the behaviour of the afflicted girls. During court proceedings, they cried out in pain, claimed to see spectral animals, mimicked the accused, and fainted in unison. Their performance became central to the prosecution's case, regardless of how implausible or theatrical it seemed. The court took their suffering as proof, their screams as divine evidence. By the end of summer, more than 150 people had been arrested, and the executions continued. Sarah Good, a homeless woman, was hanged in July after refusing to confess. Her defiance was seen not as strength, but as rebellion against God. Rebecca Nurse, a respected grandmother and member of the Salem Church, was executed despite widespread protest. Her conviction sent a chilling message. Even the most pious were not beyond suspicion. And yet the accusations did not slow. Children as young as 5 were jailed. A minister's wife was accused. Entire families were locked in cells. The colony had lost its grip on reason, consumed by the very evil it sought to destroy. Fear was now Salem's true ruler, shaping justice, warping memory, and silencing dissent. What began as a handful of strange afflictions had become something far more terrifying, a society devouring itself, one accusation at a time. As summer gave way to autumn in 1692, the Salem witch trials reached their darkest depths. The gallows on Proctor's Ledge became a grim fixture on the horizon, a place of ritual execution where cries for mercy were swallowed by the silence of final judgment. The executions were public, meant to serve as warnings. Entire communities gathered to watch. Some came in solemn fear. Others, disturbingly, treated them as spectacles. One by one, the convicted were led to the scaffold, bound and praying, until the trapdoors dropped and another life ended in the name of righteousness. In total, 19 people were hanged as witches, 14 women and 5 men. All maintained their innocence. Many died with prayers on their lips, or psalms recited through trembling voices. None of them received proper burials. As convicted witches, their bodies were denied church cemeteries. Some were buried in shallow, unmarked graves. Others were reclaimed secretly by family under cover of night. But the most gruesome death was not on the gallows. Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer, and the husband of accused witch Martha Corey, refused to enter a plea at his trial. By refusing to speak, he hoped to prevent his land from being seized by the state. In response, authorities ordered pressing, a brutal and rare form of punishment. Giles was stripped, laid on the ground, and slowly crushed beneath heavy stones. For 2 days, he endured the torture in silence. His last words, according to legend, were chillingly defiant. More weight. He died without ever entering a plea. His resistance made him a tragic symbol of the injustice that had overtaken Salem. Inside the jails, those not yet executed faced horrific conditions. Pregnant women gave birth in filthy cells. The sick died of neglect. Families had to pay for their own food and chains, and some remained imprisoned for months after the trials ended. By the time autumn leaves began to fall, Salem had sentenced more people to death for witchcraft than any other community in American history. What had begun as whispers had ended in blood. And though the executions would soon cease, the damage to Salem's soul had already been done. By the end of September 1692, the fever that had gripped Salem began to falter. The turning point came not from the courts or the clergy, but from a growing sense of unease. A recognition, too long delayed, that something had gone terribly wrong. Doubt crept in quietly. It started when respected citizens, like Rebecca Nurse and John Proctor, were hanged. If such devout, upright people could be witches, who could be trusted? When Martha Corey, a strong-willed churchgoer and even the wife of the colony's former governor, Lady Mary Phipps, were accused, the trials began to eat into the upper ranks of society. The hysteria no longer threatened just the marginalized, it threatened everyone. Reverend Increase Mather, a prominent Puritan minister and father of the influential Cotton Mather, delivered a powerful sermon against the use of spectral evidence, the very foundation of many convictions. In his words, "It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person be condemned." It was a radical reversal in tone and a quiet indictment of the court's methods. Others began to speak out as well. Ministers who had once supported the trials now urged caution. Families of the accused pleaded publicly. Communities neighboring Salem watched with horror and began distancing themselves. Faced with rising criticism and political pressure, Governor William Phipps finally acted. In October 1692, he disbanded the court of Oyer and Terminer. In its place, a new court was created, one that no longer accepted spectral evidence. The change was immediate. Of the remaining prisoners awaiting trial, most were found not guilty. For those convicted, many received reprieves. The executions stopped. Still, the damage had been done. 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, over 100 imprisoned, dozens more traumatized, families ruined, reputations shattered. The tide had turned, but slowly. Though the courts had changed, it would take months, years, for the last prisoners to be released, and longer still for the community to fully reckon with its sins. But in that autumn, the panic receded. Silence returned to the gallows. The accuser's screams faded, and Salem, wounded and ashamed, was left to confront the cold reality that it had been not witches, but fear itself, that had ruled them. When the final prisoners were released in 1693, Salem was left with more than empty cells. It was left with guilt. The trials had ended, but the echoes of accusation, betrayal, and execution lingered in every home and church pew. A silence hung over the town, and beneath it, a deep unease. In the years that followed, many of those involved in the trials began to express regret. One of the most striking apologies came from Judge Samuel Sewall. On a January day in 1697, during a day of public fasting and prayer, Sewall stood before the congregation at Boston's South Church. In front of the entire assembly, he accepted blame and shame for his role in the trials and asked God for forgiveness. It was a rare act of public contrition, and it set the tone for the years that followed. Others were not so quick to apologize. Some judges and accusers remained silent or stood by their decisions, believing they had acted in good faith. But the growing consensus, especially among clergy, was that the court had erred terribly. Even Cotton Mather, who had initially defended the use of spectral evidence, softened his tone in later writings. In 1706, Anne Putnam Jr., one of the original accusers, only a child during the trials, offered a formal confession before her church. She admitted that her accusations had led to the deaths of innocent people. She claimed she had been deluded by Satan and begged forgiveness from God and her neighbors. Her words were among the few to acknowledge the specific names of the victims. Families of the accused struggled for decades to clear their relatives' names. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill restoring the civil rights of many of those convicted and awarded monetary compensation to their heirs. But the pain remained. Not all names were cleared, and not all families were compensated. Generations grew up in the shadow of the trials. And yet, over time, Salem tried to heal. The town became a symbol, not of justice, but of what happens when fear overrides reason, when courts abandon fairness, and when hysteria is mistaken for truth. The reckoning had begun, but full justice, as history often shows, would remain elusive. More than 3 centuries have passed since the gallows stood in Salem, but the legacy of the witch trials endures, etched into American memory not as a tale of sorcery, but as a grim warning about the power of fear, the fragility of justice, and the danger of unchecked belief. The very phrase Salem witch trials has come to symbolize mass hysteria, false accusations, and moral panic. It is invoked in courtrooms, classrooms, and political speeches as a cautionary tale, proof of how easily reason can be overwhelmed by suspicion and how quickly a community can turn on its own. Today, Salem embraces its history, but not without complexity. Museums, memorials, and guided tours draw visitors from around the world. The Salem Witch Trials Memorial, dedicated in 1992 on the 300th anniversary of the trials, features 20 granite benches, each inscribed with the name of one of the executed. They do not list their crimes, because there were none. Only names, dates, and final words, testaments to dignity in the face of injustice. Yet even now, Salem's story is more than just tourism or folklore. It is a reflection of human nature. The trials reveal how fear can become contagious, how power can be abused in the name of morality, and how justice can falter when guided by emotion rather than evidence. In literature, Arthur Miller's play The Crucible gave new life to the trials, using them as an allegory for McCarthyism and the Red Scare of the 1950s. Miller reminded a new generation that witch hunts do not always involve witches, and that the past is never as distant as it seems. The descendants of the accused and the accusers still live in Massachusetts and across the United States. Some bear the burden of ancestral shame, others carry the pride of resilience and survival. In 2001, more than 3 centuries after the hangings, the state of Massachusetts formally exonerated the last 5 victims, completing the legal clearing of all accused. The Salem witch trials were brief, just over a year in length, but their lessons have proven eternal. They remind us that truth must be defended, even when fear shouts louder, and that the gravest injustices can occur not in moments of darkness, but under the full light of day.